This tuna sandwich isn't original. Okay, I know that was a weird thing to say, but bear with me for a moment. I promise there's a point to all this. It's an old statement, yeah? The idea of criticizing a homemade sandwich on its lack of innovation is, if you really think about it, kind of ridiculous. But it's not original. It's something I've made dozens of times, the exact same way, and probably will a dozen more times, with the biggest changes being what kind of cheese I add, maybe the bread, and that's completely fine. I like it this way. It's quick enough that I won't starve while making it. The phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, springs to mind because change without reason or purpose probably isn't the most helpful thing in the world. And this doesn't just apply to my delicious sandwich, it's applied to the majority of what we encounter in our daily lives. From driving to sports, to reading to cooking. I mean, following a recipe is the backbone of most people's cooking technique anyway. Essentially, it's commonly accepted that imitation is the most efficient way to accomplish a task. If it's been done before, it should work if you do it the same way again. But the thing is, it feels like the sensibility is rarely allowed to be applied to writing without someone complaining about it. A lot of people seem to have developed an attitude towards creative works that tells them something is only truly good if it's original. An original idea, an original gameplay mechanic, an original story to be told. Originality is praised every time it's shown, and that makes sense. We want to see something new. It's exciting when something different comes along and changes how we look at things. As people, we love to find a new thing and make it a part of ourselves, whether it's a new band or book or game or movie or whatever else. New is exciting and original is interesting. It's human nature and it's kind of hard to fight against it. That's when it's successful, I mean. When a new idea crashes and burns, you'll usually have people pointing to it and using it as an argument as to why it shouldn't have been tried in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. Now, when I say originality, I mean in the sense of newness, in that something is uniquely unto itself in a way that the things before it aren't. And that can be a fine line to draw. After all, it can be debated on whether something that's merely similar to what's come before can be considered original, or if it has to really and truly be different. I personally don't believe that sharing similarities takes away from the integrity of a creative work, but people are forever comparing things in an attempt to categorize everything, so there are plenty of people who would disagree with me. I'm specifically addressing the second group of people in this essay, not the first. Like I was saying, originality is generally praised, but then, on the other hand, there's also that one sentence that's often used to dismiss the premise entirely, that being that there's no such thing as an original idea. The statement is first credited to Mark Twain, wherein he expressed, "We can turn old ideas into new, curious combinations, but in the end they're the same old pieces of coloured glass that have been in use through all the ages." Essentially, he believed that no creative work at its core can be truly original. We just assemble the pieces in new and different ways. Okay, before we continue, this is the part where I lay my personal opinion out on the table for the sake of transparency. I think originality is overrated. I think it's good, and people should always strive to see such things through to the best of their ability, but I also think we put too much stock into what's entirely new, and not what's done well, and I think that's done to the detriment of newer creatives, but I'll talk more about that later. See, here's the thing. When people say there are no original ideas, and while it's not impossible, Twain meant it this way too, they say it as a wholly negative statement. They see a lack of complete originality as a sign that only the creatively bankrupt are making things anymore, and that there is no real talent or worth to be found in popular media, or any media whatsoever if they're one of those truly pretentious misery guts who relish in taking a shit on other people's passions, and that's just not true. See, the issue with this interpretation is that there's no proof Twain meant to imply this to be an assertion of negativity in the first place. He didn't exempt himself from his own claim, and he certainly took pride in his work. But over time people have adopted it as a complete dismissal of the entertainment industry, and sometimes even creativity as a whole. The idea that originality is a prerequisite to quality is a false assertion, and a generally unnoticed problem arises when we attempt to rationalize it as such. For older works, we cannot prove their originality to be the key to their success, because we can never know the true origin of most ideas and stories that we come across. We can trace tropes and archetypes and ideas back to the beginning of written language, but the true intent behind them is often lost to history, because who could possibly keep track? It's unrealistic to even ask someone to track down the birth of an idea in the first place, because finding a first implementation doesn't necessarily equate to finding the source. It just means that what you found was the first time someone had the resources, time, will, or whatever was required to make it a reality instead of just an idea. They could have gotten it from someone else and we'd never be able to tell. Knowing the true origin of any idea is completely fucking impossible. The closest we'll ever get is the first recorded instance of something, and never what inspired it or who really thought it up. Hell, if we could prove that, there wouldn't be an ongoing debate on whether Shakespeare wrote his own plays, which is an ongoing argument if you didn't already know. Writing is an expression of ideas, thought given physical form, and with that form comes a degree of permanence. It's thanks to the written word that information isn't lost to time as easily as it could be. Writing codifies ideas that they may continue to be shared, and knowledge of the origin need not necessarily be a part of that process. We can only know what we have recorded, and sadly, not everything gets recorded. Our information is always incomplete, so we can never have a full story. Our information is always incomplete, we can only ever speculate on what's missing. Back in 1949, Joseph Campbell published a book known as The Hero with 1,000 Faces, in which he laid the groundwork for the concept of the hero's journey, capitalized, which he based around the theory of the monomyth, an original story at the root of all heroic myths that each one has, intentionally or not, pulled inspiration from. He studied the mythology of many, many nations and came to the conclusion that all of them must share a common ancestor, the story of a hero's journey, not capitalized this time, that could be used to map out the structure of every heroic myth. Now, whether he was right or not is the topic of much scholarly debate, but there is an important point to note here. Campbell would go on to claim, falsely, and this was definitely overreaching a bit, that this was the only way for heroic stories to be told, and tried to apply the format to all stories with the hero. Like, all of them. Yes, even the one you're thinking of right now, he would have tried to include that. So here we have another assertion, albeit more implied than outright stated, that originality is lost to us. After all, if all stories pull their pieces from an original, then surely none of them can be original. So the problem that crops up from this is that the hero's journey, capitalized again, just cannot be fit to every story. Don't get me wrong, a lot of stories follow it, and there are plenty of writers who swear by it. Hell, if you squint hard enough at almost any story, you can kind of make it fit, just as you can with a 3-act structure. However, that still doesn't mean that all heroic stories are made with it in mind. But more to the point, even if it were true, nothing about this implies that the lack of originality takes away from the story. Nobody reading Heracles or the Epic of Gilgamesh would argue that they're made lesser by sharing tropes with older stories, or other myths of the same mythology for that matter. Nor would most people argue that the stories lose impact from a repeated theme. A lot of our most iconic modern heroes share the basic structure of their origin stories with myths and legends, and that's not really stopped people from loving them all the same. One example would be Goku from the Dragon Ball Z series, but more specifically from the original Dragon Ball. His story and character design pull heavy inspiration from that of the Monkey King from Journey to the West. Another would be Superman, whose origin story is a fairly blatant recreation of the story of Moses, and most people who make this connection aren't going around whining that Superman just isn't original enough to be good or enjoyable because Moses happened first. I know most people are complaining about character assassination in the DC cinematic universe's, let's say, less than stellar movie decisions. Regardless, what makes these stories work for people is the fact that they're done differently. More importantly, they're mostly done well. I majored in English, and I had classes with a lot of people who were worried first and foremost about one of two things. Writing what they thought would be the most popular, and writing something entirely original. The moment anyone else had an idea even remotely similar to their own, they'd often completely scrap it because they didn't want to write something like anyone else. They wanted to write something new, and this preoccupation made them absolutely terrified of having to be compared to anyone else. And these were often beginner writers, some of which had never taken a writing class before. And these two attitudes are huge problems in the creative industry. The first is often seen in executive meddling, because executives are rarely creatives and even more rarely care about artistic vision. Their priority is in making money, and to them, there's nothing better for that than copying popular trends. And then the second attitude is often seen in audiences and in creators themselves, and it can destroy confidence and stymie progress when the first thing you worry about is being completely original or doing what's the most popular, instead of having a vision and doing everything you can to see it through. I feel like this is a topic that deserves its own video if people would be interested, but I wanted to explain my view on the subject. What's important here is that quality and care trump originality any day. A story well told will always be better received than something completely new that lacks delivery, care, or attention to detail. And more often than not, the part where the most care is given is what really draws people in. Harry Potter wasn't the first book about magical schools, as many people have pointed out, but its focus on the tight-knit friendship of the main trio and their personal journeys is what really kept people coming back for more. Breath of the Wild wasn't the first Legend of Zelda game, and it was far from the first sword-fighting, world-exploring, silent protagonist-having adventure game, but its themes of loss, despair, and the fight for hope and life in a broken world struck a powerful chord with people. What matters is not where the idea comes from, but how it's implemented and how much the creator cares about the story they're telling. And that care is what people will gravitate to. I know I've made this mainly about writing, but this applies to any creative endeavor. If you care about your creations and you let it show, it will resonate with people. Your audience will connect with your passion and hard work because it always shows, and it's always what people are drawn to. A lot of what makes your work your own, despite the similarities it's certain to share with innumerable other works, is your personal perspective and lived experience. I don't want to go too into it here, since this is running a little long for my first ever video, and it's another subject that would be best explored in an essay all its own. But the general idea is that your lived experiences color your creative works. Your attitudes and feelings, your subconscious thoughts, and the influence of other people, all of these things seep into your writing and personalize it to you. You are the only one who can tell the story you want, because your vision for the story pulls directly from who you are, and that has a far greater impact on what the story is and who it resonates with than if it's a truly original idea or not. Matthew Mercer probably wasn't the first DM to be loved by the internet. Van Gogh definitely wasn't the first man to paint the night sky, and Cher, or whichever performer from before my time that people are super nostalgic for, was far from the first diva/rock star to take the stage by storm. What matters is that they each create in a way that's really and truly theirs. Don't be afraid to create for fear of unoriginality. Tell your story the way only you can tell it. Paint what can only be brought about by your own hands. Give the world the product of your love and labor, and watch as people find something to love and hold on to, because they will. People will resonate with your work and your voice, whichever form you give it. All you need to worry about is giving it that form to begin with. It has, by the way, occurred to me just how stupid it is to have this whole mess of an essay stem from a tuna sandwich, but the point still remains that something can be unoriginal and still be good, and sandwiches are some of the least original things I can think of that people still love the hell out of. So I'll just pretend this all wraps up nicely and makes sense, and I'm gonna go eat lunch now. Thanks.